What is up, guys? Welcome back to day 6, round 7 of the Orillas de Mar International Chess Tournament here in Tenerife. My name is Titus from Orillas. I'm a Grandmaster, and I would like to share my experiences and games with you from the event. So we've played 6 rounds so far, and I have the standings after round 6 on the screen. And as you can see, I was in a tie for 6th place, a big tie for 6th place, but only half a point off of 1st place as well. So definitely with still a lot to play for in the last 3 rounds. I got paired up against Larkin Vladyslav from Ukraine. He's an international master, and we actually already played with each other 2 months ago or so in Spain in San Sebastian, where I was also white and I managed to win that game then. And I kind of already knew what my opponent was playing, so I decided to kind of try a similar approach. In that game, I also played c4, and I decided to play c4 today as well. My opponent responded again with e5. And last time, I played the natural knight c3, and he surprised me a little bit with bishop b4. And I remember after thinking maybe for 5-10 minutes after he surprised me with bishop b4, I decided to play queen b3. Kind of, echoing yesterday's queen b6 move, just with the tempo up with the knight still being undeveloped on g8. And, we got into a very complicated position. Eventually, I managed to convert my advantage and win the game. But today, I decided to try my recently, again, reviewed move a3. I thought that because he also, as white, likes to play the Rossalimo, similar to my opponent yesterday, I decided that it would be prudent to not allow him to develop his bishop to b4 and try to see what other setups he knows and how comfortable is he with those setups. He blitzes out g6, and to be honest, I didn't really cover this move at all in my preparation, and I sank into a 10-minute thing. I could remember maybe one game that I saw in the database because I was checking the top games to get some ideas for myself, and I think that game I decided to go for h4. So I was trying to decide if I should go for h4 or myself or not, but I thought that maybe even just like after h6, for example, or after a normal developing move like knight f6, I didn't see what h4 really gave me in this position. So I just decided to play knight c3. I think there was also some setups maybe with g3 with a different move order. And I thought those could be, we could transpose some sort of a mainline English, reverse Sicilian. But I have this, a little bit silly move a3 that not always I would play in those positions. And I'm basically, I'm white. I'm playing a reverse Sicilian, but I played a3. So basically, it would be as if I played black against not the most ambitious setup for my opponent. So I decided to play knight c3, a bishop g7, knight f3, knight c6. My opponent only plays knight c6 after I developed my knight to f3, which makes a lot of sense because now after b4, maybe he could follow up with e4 already. And this knight is attacked, and my knight is pinned. So it makes a lot of sense to delay the knight to c6 until this move. So I decided to go for e3. He blitzes out knight g7, d4, ed, d5. And we get, after c takes d5, knight takes d5, an isolated pawn position, where I think black is completely fine already, but still with a lot to play for in this position. And a3 may seem a little bit silly, but I think it could be useful in some lines, maybe with the bishop potentially having a retreating square to a2, and also preventing some knight b4 ideas consolidating on d5, but obviously the position is completely equal. Some would prefer black. I myself don't really have a preference. I think both sides have a lot to play for. And I decided to play bishop g5 to try and develop with tempo. And initially I thought that after I played bishop g5, that queen d6 was very strong. And I was looking at the line after bishop c4, queen e6, and at first I didn't see a good way to deal with this check. But then I realized I can just play knight e2, and then he's self-pinned. I can castle and potentially develop a fairly dangerous initiative against this pin that he has on d5 and e6, and his pieces are slightly misplaced. But he can also just take on c3. I would have to take with the pawn, castles, knight a5. And this position, again, I think is probably equal. Maybe So again, I would assume most people would prefer to play black here to try to undermine the pawns, the damage structure with c5. But there's still a game to be played, and a lot of things could happen. But I think this position is pretty decent for black, and I'm really happy my opponent didn't go for this. He decided to go for f6, which I thought was that's what I was aiming for basically with bishop g5. And after bishop d2, castles bishop e2, I just complete normal development, and now his pawn has moved, and his bishop is locked, and also he's weakened his king side. So I was pretty happy with my position here. I thought there was a lot to play for here, very complex position with chances for both sides. My opponent plays knight c7, decides to go for immediately blockading the square with both of his knights, and I finished my development. And now my opponent decides to lash out with g5. Which I thought was a bold decision, to say the least, but also I thought it was somewhat incorrect, because I thought that I have a very strong response, which, I mean, it wasn't as strong as I thought it was, but compared to my other options. But I played h4. I checked with the engine briefly. He said that I could also just play like rook e1 and eventually try to play against his weakened king side. And basically, if f5 ever comes, I can potentially play with knight e5 or even just rook e2 and double up. And he has a lot of weaknesses on the king side. So the computer claims a reasonably large plus for white in those positions, which I didn't really understand why. And I was shuffling pieces a little bit. The computer kind of was moving aimlessly there, but it does like white's position based on the weaknesses on around black's king, and that makes a lot of sense, absolutely. But I think h4 is also a very sensible move, and my opponent, I thought maybe he would play h6. h6 made a lot of sense to me, but he decides to be more opportunistic, more aggressive, and optimistic about his position, and plays g4, which forces my knight to retreat, and decides to follow up with f5. Now again, I could have just played bishop c4, and computer allows my position because of the weaknesses around black's king. And after king h8, let's say knight e3, apparently I can just sack a pawn with knight e3, and if bishop d4, bishop h6 is a strong follow-up, and it's really hard to find squares for the rook, and then potentially my rook can come to e1 as well. Queen could maybe come to c1 to g5, and white is apparently has a massive advantage, like +2 or even more than that. But it was difficult to understand what was the right setup, but I definitely should have ignored the pawn on d4 completely. I decided to play with a much more sort of slow approach, knight c2, but at the same time knight on c2 is quite a bit misplaced, because in a lot of situations I also wanted to play for g3, knight g2, and try to blockade the pawns on the king side like so. So knight c2 was definitely a step in the wrong direction. Now the position basically is equal again. And my opponent follows up very naturally with king h8, just getting the king out of the way. I decide to put the rook on the open file, rook e1, and then he plays relatively quickly knight f6. Now initially I thought knight f6 was a strange move, and I didn't really understand its idea, the move's idea, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Again, as already played one game in this tournament, my opponent is trying to put the knight on the rim, so to speak, but it cannot really be attacked there, so it supports black's expansion ideas on the king's side even further, and also blocks my pawn on h4, which is a weakness. So knight f6 actually, when I started realizing my opponent's idea, made a lot of sense. And here it's already kind of difficult to say what I should do. I decided to go for queen c1 to try to establish some dark square control. After knight g6, bishop g5, queen d6, I sang into a long thing, and I was already falling pretty heavily behind on the clock because I couldn't find a good move in this position. And I believe after checking with the computer, I was seriously considering a knight b5, but I couldn't really see what would happen afterwards, because I thought queen e7, bishop f6, bishop f6, h5, knight e7, and I think black is significantly better because of two bishops and a weak pawn on d4, and I don't really have any sort of follow-up to compensate for those advantages that black has, even though his king side is a little bit weakened, but he has a lot of pieces around his king, and I do not have any sort of way to attack his king directly. So I thought this position was very unpleasant, and after thinking for maybe 20 minutes, I eventually settled down for knight e3. settled on 93, and my opponent had a very strong follow-up. He also sank into a pretty deep thing because he had a good advantage, good time advantage on the clock in the game. He thought for maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes. The best move was probably f4, just immediately asking questions, because after knight b5, black has a very strong response, queen c6, which I saw, but I thought, okay, knight f1, but then black can just ignore my queen and play knight e4, and I thought maybe I could take on c7, but apparently the computer really likes black's position because, of course, this bishop is at risk of being trapped. There's a nice initiative on the king side, and it's very difficult to see what white should do in this position. So I'm very lucky that my opponent decided not to go for this, or he didn't spot it. He instead decided to go for g3, which again shifts the evaluation completely. So from being black was better, now white is better again. Just shows how many things happen in an actual chess game. How the evaluation can swing in complicated middle games. I only have one move, which is to take, obviously, and then my opponent decides to follow up with knight e4. Again, I have only one move to take, f takes e4, and after king h2, I get my king out of the way. I protect the g3 pawn, and as computer said, I had a very nice advantage here. Again, just based on the fact that my opponent's king is weaker, I'm better developed a little bit, and I have a nice blockade going on right now against his pawn on e4. My opponent should have taken probably the pawn on d4 with the bishop, and then I think computer was giving me knight c4 just to immediately challenge the queen, and then potentially follow up with rook d1 or maybe bishop e3 or even bishop h6. Some ideas like that. My opponent, luckily for me, plays queen d4, which is a massive blunder already, and here it's already a winning advantage for white. Even though it doesn't look like much, right? It's equal material. I'm not really threatening anything, but after I play pawn to h5, the knight really has no squares where it can go to. And I'm just threatening to follow up with pawn to h6. So let's say if he goes knight e5, I could go maybe pawn h6, bishop f6, and for example, rook f1, I believe is a move. Actually, now I'm looking at maybe knight f3 is a move. Let me check real quick what the engine would suggest here. Just queen c7. Just queen c7, grab the pawn, and threaten the mate on g7. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. In this position, yeah, but besides queen c7, I guess there is not really many other moves, and yeah, rook f1 does fail. Yeah, my chess base kind of is lagging right now. Give me a second. The dragon. Okay, there we go. So yeah. So my opponent decides to not play knight e5. He decides to play h6, and I have two moves here, and I immediately, after achieving a winning position, go wrong again. The winning move was rook d1, basically with the idea that after queen takes b2, I just simplify, then I grab on h6. If he takes the rook takes a1, king h7 is the only move not to lose more material, and after bishop f8, knight f8, g4, these three pawns are apparently much more dangerous, which makes a lot of sense than these three pawns. And computer is giving a massive advantage for white, like +3 +4, which I didn't really realize during the game. But again, when you see with the evaluation, you believe it, right? Like it makes a lot of sense once you know the computer's thoughts on the position. Instead of rook to d1, I unfortunately played knight c2, and now my opponent has a saving move. It's actually a very, very cute tactic. I spotted it after he played queen f2. Which is a losing move, but the idea is the same. For example, if I decided to play bishop e3, I would actually get toasted by queen takes g3, and after king g3, bishop e5, the king has no squares to go, right? All of his squares are taken, so I have to block with the bishop, and white will lose the queen back with interest, right? So black will be potentially, not potentially, just completely winning in the position that will arise. Instead, I played h takes g6, but my opponent could have executed the same idea with a different move, which was queen e5. Funnily enough, I suggested this move to my opponent after the game, but I didn't. I forgot about the queen g3 idea because I spotted it after he played queen f2, obviously. But I completely forgot it in the analysis after the game that after queen e5, if I decide to take on h6, he can just do the same thing, queen takes g3. After king takes g3, bishop e5. This situation is better for me because I can block with the queen immediately. And then a cute line could go like knight takes f4, bishop f8, knight h3, king h4, bishop f6, king g3, bishop e5 with a weird perpetual. So again, I spotted the queen takes g3 idea after queen f2, but I failed to spot it after queen e5, and that's why knight c2 had a flaw because of queen e5, queen takes g3. Definitely reasonably tough to spot it during an actual game, but again, my opponent spotted the idea, I believe, so with queen f2, so definitely gave my opponent some rope of life there to save the game from what was already a decisive advantage for me. But after queen takes f2, yeah, I just can take on g6, and the idea being that if he takes on g5, I just take on g5, and there is no really good way of protecting from both of these checks. And if he decides to go for bishop e5, many moves with, but the simplest is bishop f6, and then queen takes h6, and it's game over. Or if king g8, bishop takes e5, obviously, and then I'm 2 pieces up. So my opponent, he had like, I don't know, 18 minutes. He thought until he had 1 minute, but he was agonizing. I saw from his face. But he decides to play on a piece down with queen b6. But obviously after, just sensible moves, I don't really spoil. It's really hard to spoil this position. Let's just say it like that. And after bishop c4, my opponent resigns. So a very, very turbulent game. My opponent could have definitely simplified the position in the opening to where it would have been very difficult to play for an advantage with knight takes c3 and or queen e6 first, and then knight takes c3 and knight a5, trying to get us some sort of a blockade and playing against my weakened structure. So the opening experiment again kind of wasn't a really big success, but after he didn't do that, he played f6. I got a nice initiative and a nice advantage. I mishandled it, and my opponent was better. Then he mishandled it, and I was winning. And then I missed one tactic. He had a chance to save the game, but he didn't find it during the game, and I ended up winning the encounter after all. So a lot of things happened in this game today. I'm definitely very relieved after today's win. I'm back finally in the rating plus. It only took 6 rounds after round 1. To recover, and tomorrow's round is at 4 p.m. and I'll see you all after the game.